The encrypted email arrived at 0347 hours local time while I was reviewing intelligence briefings at Forward Operating Base Delta in eastern Afghanistan. The subject line read, "Urgent, legal documentation required, innocuous enough that it passed through military security filters without triggering alerts." Inside was a PDF of paperwork that made my blood run cold, articles of dissolution for Mitchell and Associates Security Consulting, the company I'd co-founded with my business partner 3 years earlier. My name appeared nowhere in the restructuring documents. According to the legal filing dated just 2 weeks prior, I had voluntarily relinquished all interests and claims to the business, effective immediately. The signature on the waiver looked convincingly like mine, but I'd never seen these documents before in my life. I sat in the communications tent, surrounded by the hum of satellite equipment and encrypted radio chatter, processing what this meant. My partner, Marcus Mitchell, had systematically erased me from the company we'd built together, forging my signature, filing false documentation, and timing it precisely during my military deployment when I couldn't respond immediately. What Marcus didn't realize was that 3 months ago, sensing something wasn't right during our last video conference, I'd quietly reached out to certain contacts from my previous military service. People with specialized skills in corporate investigation and strategic response. People who didn't take kindly to anyone screwing over active duty personnel. I closed my laptop, walked outside into the pre-dawn darkness of the Afghan mountains, and made a secure satellite call to a number Marcus had never seen in any of our business records. "Colonel Hayes speaking." The voice was crisp, professional, unmistakably military. "Sir, this is Captain Thompson. We have a situation. My name is David Thompson, 32 years old, currently serving my second deployment as an Army intelligence officer, specializing in counterintelligence operations. Before my military career, I'd spent 4 years in corporate security consulting after graduating from West Point, building expertise in threat assessment, corporate espionage prevention, and executive protection. That background led me to co-found Mitchell and Associates with Marcus Mitchell, a former CIA analyst who shared my vision of providing high-end security consulting to Fortune 500 companies. Our partnership had been built on complementary skills. My tactical and operational experience paired with his analytical and networking abilities. Together, we'd grown the company from a 2-person operation run out of Marcus's apartment to a respected firm with 12 employees and contracts worth over $3.80 million annually. We specialized in executive protection, corporate counterintelligence, and security assessments for companies operating in high-risk environments. The business model was sound, our reputation solid, and our client retention rate exceptional. Before my current deployment, we'd been discussing expansion into cybersecurity services and potentially opening a second office in Los Angeles. Everything seemed to be progressing exactly as planned. The first crack in our partnership had appeared 6 months before my deployment, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. Marcus had begun expressing concerns about my military commitments, particularly after I was notified of this upcoming deployment to Afghanistan. It's difficult to maintain client confidence when half the leadership team could be called away. "At any moment," he'd said during what I thought was a routine planning meeting, "some clients are asking specifically about continuity of service. I propose solutions, enhanced documentation of our procedures, cross-training of staff, clear communication protocols to maintain operations during my absence." We'd implemented these measures successfully during my previous deployment 2 years earlier. But Marcus's concerns seemed to go deeper than operational logistics. "David, I'm wondering if it might be time to restructure," he'd suggested near the end of our conversation. "Perhaps transition you to more of an advisory role, given your military obligations." I dismissed the idea immediately. The company was as much mine as his. I'd invested equally in startup costs, developed half our client relationships, and created most of our operational protocols. More importantly, my military experience was a significant selling point for clients operating in volatile regions. They specifically wanted someone who understood both corporate requirements and operational security in dangerous environments. "Marcus, "We've discussed this before," I'd replied firmly. "My military service enhances our credibility, it doesn't diminish it. And my deployments are temporary. This partnership works because we each bring unique strengths." He'd nodded and seemed to drop the subject, but something in his demeanor had shifted. Over the following weeks, I noticed subtle changes: client meetings scheduled during times I couldn't attend, conversations that ended abruptly when I entered a room, increased emphasis on his individual contributions in marketing materials. 3 months before my deployment, during my final security clearance review, I'd mentioned these concerns to Colonel Hayes, my former commanding officer who now worked in military liaison with defense contractors. The conversation had been informal, part of our regular check-ins, but Hayes had listened with the sharp attention I remembered from our years working together. "Partnerships can be fragile things," he'd observed, "especially when one partner sees opportunity in the other's absence. You might want to consider protective measures." Acting on that advice, I'd quietly documented everything: client contracts, financial records, operational procedures, communication logs. I'd also secured copies of all company documents and locations Marcus couldn't access, and established separate relationships with key clients, ostensibly for continuity during deployment, but actually as insurance against exactly what was now happening. Most importantly, I'd briefed Colonel Hayes on the company's structure, value, and my concerns about Marcus's intentions. Hayes had connected me with a network of retired military officers who now worked in corporate security and business consulting, people who understood both military loyalty and corporate maneuvering. "If something happens while you're deployed," Hayes had said, "you'll have advocates who know the real situation." Now, sitting in the communications tent with the dissolution paperwork glowing on my laptop screen, I realized how prescient that preparation had been. The forged signature was sophisticated, clearly created by someone with access to multiple examples of my handwriting and signature from legitimate company documents. The timing was calculated to take advantage of my limited communication windows and inability to respond immediately to legal challenges from a combat zone. The paperwork itself was meticulously prepared, with backdated authorizations and carefully constructed language designed to make my voluntary departure appear legitimate, but Marcus had made several critical errors. First, he'd filed the paperwork in Virginia, where our company was incorporated, without realizing that Virginia has specific protections for active duty military personnel against fraudulent business dealings. Second, he'd moved too quickly, filing documents before the minimum notification period had elapsed. Most importantly, he had no idea that I'd been preparing for exactly this scenario for months. Within hours of receiving the dissolution notice, I'd initiated a multi-pronged response through channels Marcus couldn't monitor or intercept. Colonel Hayes activated the network we'd established, while I provided documentation proving the fraudulent nature of Marcus's actions. By 1800 hours that same day, I'd received confirmation that a temporary restraining order had been filed in Virginia courts, freezing all company assets pending investigation of the dissolution documents. Simultaneously, my documented evidence of forgery had been forwarded to the FBI's white-collar crime division. As interstate business fraud involving active military personnel fell under federal jurisdiction, the investigation that followed moved with remarkable efficiency, aided by the comprehensive documentation I'd prepared months earlier. Marcus had apparently believed that my deployment would provide him with months of unopposed control over the company's dissolution and asset distribution. Instead, he found himself facing federal fraud charges within a week of filing the paperwork. The scope of his betrayal became clear as investigators examined our company's recent activities. Marcus had been systematically transferring client relationships to a new company he'd established privately, using our existing contracts and client information to establish competing services under his sole control. He'd also diverted nearly $280,000 in company funds to his personal accounts, disguising the transfers as operational expenses and contractor payments. Most damaging to his case was the discovery of communications with a competitor, Sentinel Strategic Solutions, discussing the acquisition of our client base and operational protocols once he'd successfully eliminated me as a partner. These emails, recovered from his personal accounts during the federal investigation, revealed a conspiracy that had been developing for over 6 months. Your partner was essentially selling the company he'd stolen from you, Colonel Hayes explained during one of our secure communications. The FBI has documentation showing he'd negotiated a $2.8 million buyout with Sentinel, contingent on his becoming sole owner of Mitchell and Associates. The criminal case against Marcus progressed rapidly once the evidence was compiled. Faced with federal charges of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy, his legal counsel advised cooperation in exchange for reduced sentencing. The plea agreement required full restitution of stolen funds, cancellation of any agreements with competitor companies, and acknowledgement of my legitimate ownership stake in Mitchell and Associates. But criminal justice was only one component of my response. Through the network Colonel Hayes had established, I'd also initiated a comprehensive business recovery strategy. While Marcus was dealing with federal investigators, former military colleagues with business expertise were working to preserve client relationships and maintain operational continuity. Chief among these allies was Rebecca Santos, a retired Navy intelligence officer who now ran a business consulting firm specializing in crisis management. She'd volunteered to serve as interim executive management for Mitchell and Associates while I completed my deployment, ensuring that our clients received uninterrupted service and that the company's reputation remained intact. Your clients are actually impressed by how you've handled this crisis, Rebecca reported during one of our weekly video conferences. Several have commented that your preparation and professional response demonstrate exactly the kind of strategic thinking they expect from a security consulting firm. Indeed, rather than damaging our business, the incident had actually enhanced our credibility. Word spread quickly through the corporate security community about how I'd anticipated and neutralized a serious business threat while deployed in a combat zone. New clients began approaching us specifically because of the demonstrated competence this situation had revealed. 3 months into the legal proceedings, Marcus requested a meeting through his attorney. The federal case was progressing inevitably toward conviction. The financial restitution was consuming his personal assets, and Sentinel Strategic Solutions had terminated all discussions once the criminal charges became public. He was facing personal bankruptcy in addition to likely prison time. I agreed to the meeting, conducted via secure video conference from our base's legal assistance office. Marcus appeared diminished, the confident, smooth-talking partner I remembered replaced by someone who looked exhausted and desperate. David, I made a huge mistake, he began without preamble. I was afraid of losing the business while you were deployed, and I convinced myself that taking control was protecting our investment. You convinced yourself that stealing was protection, I replied, keeping my voice level. I panicked when Sentinel approached me about acquisition. They said they'd only deal with a single owner, that partnership structures were too complicated for their corporate structure. I thought if I could secure the deal and then bring you back in as an employee? As an employee in the company I co-founded? The absurdity was almost remarkable. Marcus looked down, unable to maintain eye contact through the video connection. The lawyers are saying I'm looking at federal prison. My wife is filing for divorce. I've lost everything. I let the silence stretch before responding. Yes, you have. The question is whether you understand why. Because I betrayed my partner and broke federal law, he said quietly. Because you forgot that trust is the foundation of any partnership, especially in our business, I corrected. Our clients trust us to protect their most sensitive operations. How could I ever work with someone who demonstrated such complete disregard for partnership agreements? The conversation concluded with Marcus formally agreeing to a complete transfer of his ownership stake to me in exchange for my agreement not to pursue additional civil damages beyond the criminal restitution requirements. It was a clean separation that left me as sole owner of the company he tried to steal. The federal case concluded 6 months later with Marcus receiving an 18-month prison sentence and $350,000 in restitution payments. Sentinel Strategic Solutions faced additional investigation for their role in the conspiracy. ultimately resulting in significant regulatory sanctions and loss of several government contracts. I returned from deployment to find Mitchell and Associates transformed. Rebecca Santos had not only maintained operations but had implemented several improvements to our business model. We'd gained 6 new clients, including 2 Fortune 100 companies specifically attracted by our demonstrated crisis management capabilities. Your preparation saved the company, Rebecca explained during my reintegration briefing. But more than that, it demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking and operational security your clients expect. This incident became a case study in professional competence. 6 months after my return, I promoted Rebecca to Chief Operating Officer and expanded our services to include business security consulting, helping other companies protect themselves against the kind of internal threats we'd successfully neutralized. The experience with Marcus had provided invaluable real-world expertise in corporate betrayal and response strategies. A year later, Mitchell and Associates had grown to 22 employees with annual revenues exceeding $6.2 million. We'd opened the Los Angeles office we'd originally planned, specializing in entertainment industry security. Our client base had expanded internationally, with contracts in 3 countries specifically requesting our services. Based on our reputation for handling complex security challenges, the military network that had protected me during Marcus's betrayal had evolved into a formal business alliance. We now regularly collaborated with other veteran-owned security firms, sharing resources and expertise across a range of specializations. Colonel Hayes joined our advisory board after his retirement, bringing additional credibility and connections to our operations. During my final conversation with Marcus before his incarceration, he'd asked the question that stayed with me. How did you know to prepare for this? How did you see it coming when I thought I was being subtle? Military intelligence training, I'd replied. We learn to identify threats before they fully materialize, to prepare for contingencies others don't consider. But mostly I learned to pay attention when someone's actions don't align with their stated intentions. It was a lesson that extended far beyond business partnerships. Trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to repair. But preparation, strategic thinking, and reliable allies can protect against almost any betrayal. Lessons equally valuable in combat zones and corporate boardrooms. The business that Marcus had tried to steal through deception and fraud had ultimately become stronger, more successful, and more respected than either of us had originally envisioned. The network of military professionals who'd helped me recover it had evolved into ongoing business relationships that benefited everyone involved. Most importantly, I'd learned that the skills developed through military service, strategic planning, threat assessment, operational security, were just as valuable in civilian business as they were in military operations. My business partner removed me from our company while I was deployed overseas, unaware that I'd already contacted people who specialized in protecting military personnel from exactly that kind of betrayal. In trying to steal what we'd built together, he'd actually provided me with the opportunity to build something much larger and more successful than either of us had originally imagined. Sometimes the greatest favor someone can do for you is to show their true character clearly enough that you can respond appropriately, and in Marcus's case, that favor came with enough advance warning to ensure that his betrayal became the foundation for something much better than what he'd tried to destroy. The company still bears his name in Mitchell and Associates. A reminder that partnerships require trust, that preparation prevents catastrophe, and that the networks you build during military service extend far beyond the uniform, sometimes providing exactly the protection you need when you need it most.